Well, what an incredible, incredible time to be alive, to be in technology, and to be in open source. We are seeing just this extraordinary acceleration in innovativeness, in access, and in just the pace at which software is being reimagined, redeveloped, redesigned, re-engineered. Um, what is profoundly exciting for me is that open source is at the center of this revolution, right? And I think that's profoundly exciting. It also is a huge responsibility for those of us who are in open source, because we are literally defining the materials, the raw materials of the next wave of technology. And I think the next wave of disruption and change in every single industry on the planet. Software engineering is first, but the agentic revolution will touch every aspect of human endeavor in, I believe, profoundly positive and exciting ways. I want to touch very briefly on Canonical in the context of Ubuntu. It has been, a stressful but exciting and exhilarating 6 months since our last summit. Some highlights for me: the work that we have done recently with VMware, where we're enabling their Kubernetes and their ability to essentially deliver open source applications to a global enterprise audience. With Qualcomm, where we are underpinning their push into IoT. Exciting work with NVIDIA focused on mission critical, safety critical applications for open source. Think automotive, think industrial type applications, where the ability to reason with precision around what open source is doing is a critical capability. And with AMD, where landing ROCm directly in Ubuntu, I think really transforms the experience of engineers building complex, sophisticated mathematical capabilities with AMD GPUs. As a company, we are now closing in on 1,500 colleagues, of whom nearly 1,000 are software engineers. So it is just incredible when we get together, as we did 2 weeks ago in Madrid, to look at the breadth and the range of open source that we're able to meaningfully interact with and engage with, the number of communities that we can work with. And those 1,000 engineers, 1,500 colleagues are spread over 80 countries. So I still deeply believe in the future of work as a global collaborative effort. And I think agents will only accelerate that move. As a business, we're growing at around 20%, so double the rate of our kind of obvious competitors in the open source industry. And while we deeply respect and admire the work of our counterparts at those companies, we're very, very proud of the fact that Ubuntu continues to be at the center of the most innovative work and the teams that are the efforts of the teams that are really looking to define the future, whether that's in a bank or whether that's in an aerospace company or an automotive company or a technology company. We focus our efforts on supporting those who want to be at the leading edge of innovation. We also continuously see ourselves being pulled into categories where rigor, resilience, reliability are the key requirements. I talked earlier about the work that we're doing with NVIDIA on safety critical applications for Linux and open source. And I think we have to find technically sophisticated ways to balance our desire to deliver the latest and the greatest and the best of open source with the additional requirements that come when lives are at stake, safety is at stake, and regulatory constraints are in force. Now we are at the dawn of a new era, the era of agentic engineering. And that is a bit of a roller coaster. We're all on the roller coaster. Some people love roller coasters, other people not so much. And so this is a time that is both exciting and unsettling at the same time, sometimes for the same people, right? We can all find things that we're just super excited about. We can also find things that make us uncomfortable, make us uneasy, and that gives us the sense that there is work to be done to figure out how to do this properly in the world of open source. And that's really what I want to focus on in these open remarks. I want to talk about speed. I want to talk about safety, and I want to talk about community in the agentic open source era. Now, we have always, the word Ubuntu is fundamentally is a signal that we care about people and the impact that open source has in people. And one axis that we always talk about is that we care equally about people who are exceptional innovators, right? People who are true inventors, true category leaders. But we also care about newbies. We care about people who are passionate about open source, but haven't yet in any sort of sense, made a huge mark. Open source has made a huge impression on them rather than them making an impression on open source. And sometimes I think, Redditors love to declare their departure from the land of the newbie. I always think that if they are going to become exceptional innovators and contributors, then they will come full circle back to Ubuntu, because they'll come to appreciate the things that we also stand for, right? The rigor and the commitment to the long-term stability and support of the software that we publish. But there's another way to sort of think about this axis, and this is very meaningful for me, which is that we also care about both the very wealthiest people in technology, right? The people who, for whom this is an economic story, and the very poorest people in technology, right? I always say that our ability to provide the same platform, precisely the same bits, to an engineer who is working at the heart of a hedge fund, the most lucrative kind of work on the planet, right? And an engineer, who aspires to greatness, who's growing up in the suburbs of Calcutta, right? Or pick a marginalized community anywhere on the planet, right? Our ability to deliver Ubuntu to both of those people in the same form on the same day, with equal rights, as it were, is an important and deeply motivating story for me, right? And I want to return to that later, because I think it's kind of a critical anchor point in how we think about this transition to agentic engineering. So let me zoom in on speed, right? One measure of the excitingness of the times is what I call the curl to bashometer. Do you have your own curl to bashometer, right? The doomsday clock, which counts down to, tells you how close you are to global thermonuclear war. Well, this tells you just exactly how exciting things are in software, right? And right now, we are well on our way. You can't swing a cat on the internet without seeing scary shit like this, right? And this just makes my toes curl, just right? So, exciting, right? What this tells us is that there is very interesting and important stuff that is happening faster than the traditional processes to kind of figure out how to deliver software can move, right? So yeah, this tells us things are exciting, but it also is a kind of a warning flag to us about what issues we're likely to see, right? And so what we really need, one of the sort of critical foundational things that I think we need in this era is to focus on the secure, auditable, predictable, and manageable mechanisms to deliver software at the speed at which people want to innovate today, right? And so, this has been a theme for us. We long ago realized that the rigor and precision that make Debian great also effectively are a constraint on the speed at which we can get interesting stuff in the hands of users, right? And so that has been at the heart of our desire to kind of blaze a trail to find newer, more precise ways to deliver the latest and greatest bits. So I just took a snapshot this morning from Popey, and Popey's here. Sorry, Popey. From his Snap Store update dashboard. What I love about this is it tells you, again, just how fast things are moving in the Snap Store, right? Just this morning, as of 20 minutes ago, 3 new snaps today, 71 updated today. And this really is the mechanism that we are focused on to put, to move bits securely, reliably, and auditably from the publishers, the inventors, the innovators, directly to users of Ubuntu. So obviously that comes with all sorts of question marks, right? What is the reliability story? What is the resilience story? What is the security story around there? And just to kind of walk through that, if we replace curl pipe to bash with sudo snap install, you're still doing, that critical thing. You're still essentially saying, I want to run software from someone I've never met, right, on the internet, and software that hasn't necessarily been through Debian or been through a distribution. I want to run that right now on this system right here, right? So you're still doing that same kind of crazy leap of faith that you do when you run somebody else's software, right? But you're doing it with signatures, right? Every bit of software is signed and audited. If you're curling and piping to bash, you might be able to find some signatures somewhere. 99.99999% of people would never check those signatures, right? You're doing that with automatic updates by default. It doesn't have to be automatically updated, but what you're saying is, I want to run the software, and if the software improves tomorrow, I want to have that improved version of that software tomorrow. You're doing that across heterogeneous architectures. We live in a world where you might have an ARM laptop, you might have an x86 system, which is where your CI/CD is going to be, and you may have an ARM server, which is your production environment as well. And that entire pipeline, all of our pipelines need to become completely heterogeneous aware. Delivering software this way allows us to deliver exactly the same bits that have been through exactly the same sets of tests and so on x86, ARM, RISC-V, Power, Z, right? And if there's any other instruction set we should be doing, you let me know, right? To deliver those bits, into the hands of the people who want it on the platforms that they want to run it on. Critically in here, you also get enterprise version control. In other words, you get the ability for an organization to say, look, when Cisco says that there is a version 131 of this software, we don't automatically want it to land on every server. We want to be able to decide when that change is going to happen in our environment. So there's this tension between the desire of a publisher to put out the latest and greatest and the willingness of a consumer to essentially get that. But that tension has to be managed. If you do it in a brittle kind of I'll do it when I want way, you can't do it programmatically and by policy, you end up with essentially stagnant software, right? So the beauty of this is the ability to essentially drive by policy the rollout of software from publishers to consumers of all sorts. Edge, beta, candidate, stable channels, hotfix branches, the ability to essentially say, we have a fix on a piece of software that we want to deliver only to people who have this issue, and have people say, okay, I only want to get changes to the software associated with that particular change. Progressive releases, the ability as a publisher to say, look, I want to put this out there, but I only want to put it out there for 1% of the users because stuff happens, right? And the ability to then dial that up and release progressively to a wider audience. And in the common case, strict confinement. The idea that, look, this piece of software should only be able to do the things that it plausibly needs to do on my system. That is a critical capability. And I think the central argument in favor of a move to containerized software delivery and deployment in the first place. Now, Reddit has lots of opinions about stuff, including snaps, but they remain the single best safest way to deliver bits to any Linux distro on the planet, period, right? And there are other mechanisms that are containerized, Docker and so on, Kubernetes and so on. But if you're talking about bits to the fingertips of a developer, bits to the fingertips of a user, application bits, this remains where it's at. And we will continue to dive deep into that. Now, I want to touch on confinement because there are times when confinement isn't the right thing. And these, of course, are your dangerous times, right? Your exciting times. So if you are invited to snap install something -- classic, you need to know that is curl to bash, right? But it is curl to bash with all of the other properties that I described, signatures, automatic updates, the certainty of who the publisher is, and so on and so forth, right? But it is fundamentally saying, do this in the old-fashioned way, where there's no confinement around that software. And why is that interesting? It's interesting because, in today's conversation, the biggest agent productivity boost you will see comes when you unleash the agent, right? We started in an era of, chat, please advise me on how to do the software. We are now in the era of delegation, right? Please run this machine, right? And so when you sudo snap install open code -- classic, you are saying to both this code that you're running and the model that is driving that harness, you're saying you're in control, right? This system now belongs to you. I give up the ability to reason about this system. You as an agent are unleashed. And that's the right answer in some cases. So the ability to do both of those things through a single capability, I think, is important. That, of course, then leads to the conversation around safety and how we reason about and plan for and manage the safety of agents unleashed, right? And here it's clear sandboxing is the critical capability, right? And the ability to essentially understand the sandboxing and choose the right sandboxing for a given mode of operations is critical. And I often find, the sort of Twitter effect leads to kind of a herd behavior. People say, well, we have this one thing, we want to swing this one thing, this one hammer at every problem, right? So, everybody's familiar with Docker as a way of both delivering software and essentially confining software. Run it in a Docker image and it's confined. But I think we need a much richer toolbox for sandboxing for any number of different reasons. And this has been a kind of a critical area of R&D for us. We have long believed that the container capabilities in the Linux kernel allow for much more interesting and much richer kinds of confinement and containment than the traditional OCI, Kubernetes, Docker image on its own will do, right? So on Ubuntu right now, think about sandboxing with Docker, sandboxing with snaps, right? A snap is a container, right? When a snap is running, when software is running, not classic, then it is running in a container, but it's a container that has certain management properties that allow you to reason differently than you could with Docker. Think about LexD, LexC. These are system containers. Give an agent the ability to believe that it has all the tools and capabilities of a full system without requiring all of the resource and footprints of a full system. Then take it further to VMs and say, there are situations where even a container binary, a kernel enforced boundary, right, isn't enough to keep this agent bottled, right? Keep the genie in the lamp, right? So we want VMs with multipass and LexD. We have the ability to essentially create these environments on Windows, Mac, and Linux, right, in a highly predictable way. And very excitingly, we now see the emergence of microVMs, so things that essentially cross over and blend the properties of VMs and containers. And I think this is a critical new capability in the toolbox. So I mentioned multipass. Multipass is essentially saying we need to bring these capabilities to the Windows and Mac crowd, right? So that they too have access to all the things that we take for granted. Right? Okay, I want to double click a little bit on the sort of agentic workspace story, right? So here we're talking about saying, look, imagine an organization that wants to run thousands of agents at the same time. Compute, is ultimately a limited resource, one way or the other. It needs to be managed. Efficiency is rewarded, right, in our kind of world, and rightly so. How do we run agentic workspaces very efficiently? And the answer is to essentially use containers where it is safe to use containers. So the picture here is really showing an Ubuntu system with, right. So I was talking about sandboxing and the technologies of sandboxing. So LexD with system containers, sort of full system containers, allows us to give agents a complete environment where they can run all the tools, they can fetch packages, they can run snaps, they can run other containers, but do that in a super dense way, right? So this is a critical capability for organizations that essentially want to unleash thousands of parallel agents, but essentially give those agents full operating environments, give them a root in an Ubuntu system or another distro system effectively, and do that efficiently, where your constraint is not GPUs typically, but CPUs, right? Interestingly, the emergence of the agentic sort of era puts CPUs back into the picture as one of the bottlenecks on your whole thing. Your GPUs, of course, are going to be working like crazy to support the essentially the model calculations, but in an agentic engineering world, you're essentially working in normal environments, and you become CPU constrained again, right? Your agents have to be able to run tools, install software, remove software, and do all the sorts of things that you typically do on CPUs. So both classes of compute suddenly become boundary conditions effectively on how much you can get done. So we spent a lot of time working with this kind of capability to enable very dense agentic capacity for organizations. And along the way, we started to become really aware of this tension in the developer context between the sensitive information that you as a developer typically have in your environment, right? You have keys, you have credentials, you have personal information, you have corporate information, and that typically lives in your laptop, right? In the environment in which you work. You personalize that environment, right? It becomes friendly to you by having all of those things. But those aren't necessarily things you want to give an agent that is plugged into a remote model, right? And so how do we bridge those worlds? And working with LexD, we started to explore the ability to essentially decorate a system container with a carefully curated set of things that are appropriate for the untrusted software in that system container to work with, right? So imagine we say, let's ask LexD to make a container, and then we want to bring only the selected pieces of critical personal information that either makes that friendly for us or essentially enables the particular piece of work we want to do there, right? Say, for example, I want to have an agent working on a piece of software that needs a data set. I might want to provide just that data set from my laptop or workstation to that agent. And so we started building a capability around LexD that we call Workshop. And Workshop is the single nicest thing that I have seen in terms of enabling developers to sit down and become productive in an agentic environment, but more broadly than that, in a complex environment that they didn't define for themselves. So imagine you have a new colleague that joins a team, you have a complex code base, and you need to get that colleague to go from 0 to 1, from 0 to productive as fast as possible. If you have a Workshop definition in your tree, then that becomes as simple as clone the tree and Workshop launch, right? So Workshop is a tool that essentially says, all right, I'm going to stand up a workspace, a workshop. Today, that is a system container. And then I'm going to bind into that system container all the key capabilities that would be essentially sensitive capabilities that have to be managed carefully. For example, figure out how to allow somebody in there to sign Git commits or push to a remote Git repository using sensitive credentials, but do that in a controlled, mediated fashion, right? So you can snap install Workshop today. It's a 0.9, but we are super excited about it, incredibly pleased with how that experience has come together. And we've been working with a number of ISVs to package up their pieces of software as SDKs. Workshop natively understands SDKs. There is a store for SDKs. So you can effectively get SDKs that are digitally signed, that come from a trusted source, that have been through, that have provenance associated with them, and run those SDKs in these sandboxed environments in a highly predictable, highly reliable way. Now, obviously, in today's conversation, agents would be the scary thing you might put into that sandbox. But in fact, if you just step back, our world for the last number of years has been an accelerating world of this blend of trusted and untrusted software. Maybe there is a brilliant new startup that is doing phenomenal work in a particular kind of data, and they have an SDK. It is a pile of proprietary code. If you put it on your laptop and run it as root, you're essentially handing control of your laptop to that organization, right? Not just that organization, but anything that influences their build and publication toolchain. So we started building this before agents in a world where we wanted to give people safe places to run mixed mode code that they would get from the open source community, that they might get from Ubuntu, Debian, your preferred Linux distro, with code that might come from a publisher or a vendor that's not open source, where you don't have that set of promises. We want to create those spaces so that you could do that at speed and with confidence. Today, of course, that is absolutely perfect for an agent, right? You can unleash an agent in there and you have the safety of the sandbox. But this is just the start. In recent weeks, we have been very excited to work with NVIDIA on technology that they're leading in the open source community, which is microVMs. So the idea is to be able to harden the boundary of those sandbox using underlying CPU constructs from virtualization, while still providing a very fast, very lightweight environment where you can start quickly, you can work productively, and you can cycle environments very efficiently. So if you think about what things like Firecracker do for us on the public cloud, the ability to start fast, be small, be efficient, and bring that into the developer experience, bring that into the production experience for agentic workflows. This is, I think, the next generation technology to watch. And today you can snap install OpenShell. That will give you essentially microVMs on demand, and it will give you microVMs with a selection of agents prepackaged effectively. So you can spin up a Claude agentic space, you can spin up a Copilot agentic space, you can spin up an agentic space of your own design effectively, and have that run with the additional protections that virtualizations give us. I think this is a technology to watch. So speed, safety, what about community? It has long been, part of our DNA that we work in equal partnership with people from anywhere on the planet, regardless of their, corporate affiliation, regardless of their means. Effectively, all you needed was a beaten up old piece of PC and Ubuntu, and you could be part of what we do. And I have a real concern that in this era which ties productivity and even the ability to understand the software that you are working with, right, ties that to tokens, right? We have a whole new sort of question of access and sustainability to address. And I think this is something that we, the Ubuntu community, should have front and center in our thinking as we kind of lead this transition. Now, I value deeply and consider to be extremely important our relationships with the people who are at the frontier and typically working nowadays with proprietary models and tools. It is equally important for us to care about putting those proprietary tools into the hands of those developers that can afford them and need them to do the work that they do, right? I have no problem with that at all, but it is a critical principle for me that we should not essentially focus all of our attention there to the exclusion of the access to open source that is at the heart of Ubuntu, right? And so we need to think very hard about this and figure out how we bring the poorest members of our digital society and those who are passionate but haven't yet, hit the big time, into the fold and keep them in the fold as we move through this agentic era, right? And so really one of the big questions for us has been, what does it mean for us to make our primary focus the open source coding assistants and harnesses and the open weight models? And I can tell you now, we've been really focused on this question, and I am now completely confident that we can both stay at the cutting edge, working with our commercial partners, and enable the upliftment of the next generation of technologists if we make this our primary focus, right? Of course, the competition, the diversity, the full range of capabilities is critical, right? Every single major organization, I think, will be on both sides of this line of open source and open weight and proprietary, and I think that's fine, right? It is going to be critical for us to stay on both sides of that line, right? And to hold those communities or those different ways of working and kinds of access as central to our mission. All right. So speed, safety, and community. Speed, you can get the latest, best, greatest software as of 30 seconds ago with snap install, right? And you can get guardrails, constraints, and confinements around that. Safety, right? Workshop and the movement to essentially sandboxing and agentic workspaces, right, is how we are going to deliver safety and reason about safety in this environment of delegation to agents, right? And community with open source and weights. Now, to tell you a little bit more about how Ubuntu responds and leads in this, I'm delighted to welcome Jon Seager, VP of Engineering for Ubuntu.
Hello, welcome everybody again. It's very good to see you all here. So I'm going to just quickly carry on Mark's train of thought before we look at Ubuntu 26.04 and what we managed to deliver there. I'm going to cover a lot of my thoughts on AI and Ubuntu in this talk. A couple of weeks ago, I published this article, which has been SEO'd to death, I think, by now. So if you search for that title, you'll see a full write-up of kind of my thoughts on this. There are a few key ideas in this that I really want to focus on when we talk about Ubuntu. The first is the idea of implicit versus explicit AI features in Ubuntu. I don't know that that's the final wording of how I want to articulate that, but that's how I'm thinking about it at the moment. And the distinction really is between features that Ubuntu already has that can get quietly better because we now have access to certain kinds of models, and then features that haven't existed in Ubuntu that are now possible because we have AI and are very obviously AI-powered features. And I think there's actually plenty in the first category which are really, really exciting. Those might include things like accessibility features, screen reading, speech to text. It might be things like better focusing on your camera or the enhancement of your voice through your microphone. These won't necessarily obviously be AI features, and they don't need enormous models and cloud inference to be very, very effective. Right? They can run on your laptop, even on your CPU, very, very efficiently. With the explicit features, I think that's going to be more of a shift, and I want to take time over that to make sure we do something meaningful, do something impactful, do something genuinely useful, rather than just wedging a model in Ubuntu so we can say we got there quicker than our competitors, which I don't think is a particularly useful thing to thrust upon our users. In that post, I also talked a lot about local first inference and how our work with the silicon vendors is increasingly important for that story. Right now, there is a gap between your 4 billion parameter Gemma model, which is remarkably capable, but not in comparison to a trillion parameter model hosted by insert name of favorite vendor here. But I think that's going to change really quickly. The advancements that are happening in silicon, essentially at every size of silicon chip you can think of, is happening so fast that it's going to be very, very possible for most people to run very capable models for the vast majority of their tasks on their laptop over the next couple of years. And I'd really like to make sure that we are right at the front of that with the silicon partners we work with, so that as people are buying their shiny new hardware, which is very expensive at the moment, they can actually use all of it. So there's lots more detail in that post about how we're thinking about fundamentally incentivizing engineers to use agentic tools, and also how we intend to measure them. And the blunt fact of it is, I don't actually intend to measure how much AI anyone is using. My belief is we can just continue to measure people how we've always measured people. What is their output? What is the perception of their productivity, the quality of their work? And I think it will become clear very, very quickly, those who have figured out how to use these tools properly. There is absolutely, in my mind, no sense in us going on a mad rush to see who can spend the most tokens. I don't really understand that craze. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The other thing is on agents and in open source and our part in it. You will see, no doubt, lots of people jumping up and down saying they're very disappointed that Canonical is going to talk about AI, introduce AI, use agents, integrate models. But honestly, we can't not. I see the world as I see this whole thing as much more dangerous for open source if players like Canonical don't get involved. Like, this is a company, a community with 20 plus years of demonstrated kind of good behavior, good intentions, and understanding of open source and what it means both from a technical perspective and a social perspective. And for players like us and similar to step out of the conversation on apparent moral grounds is not going to do anybody any good. So I think it's worth recognizing that there are problems in the open source community and AI contributions right now. Lots of you will have seen the various famous examples of slop contributions, people showing up for the first time in a project with 10,000 lines of code they haven't really looked at, and maintainers very rightfully feeling the strain of that. But that isn't going to get any better if all of the people who have understood how open source works and are starting to understand what sustainability looks like in open source run away from it. And so I think there is an element of we're going to have to go through a little bit of pain as an open source community to basically get the next generation of people understanding how to contribute constructively, and also enable them to basically power the next generation of open source. Open source already looks really different to what it looked like 30 years ago, and it's going to look different again in the next 5, 10, 15 years, and this is kind of a natural evolution. So I think what we see now is loads and loads of excitement, and that's where you're seeing PRs coming left, right, and center to all your favorite projects. But in the end, it's all going to converge back on open source. Because writing your own device driver for your favorite bit of hardware is really fun for the first 5 minutes. But as we have learned over time, people don't necessarily want to maintain that. It's not necessarily going to keep up to date. And so in the end, I think once the excitement is over, there's going to be a huge convergence back on a set of really high quality open source pieces that everybody can use. And so I think it's incredibly important that we as a community, as a company, are a part of that conversation. So some goals over the next 6 months. In 2610, my hope is that you will be able to press a button and talk into any field that you could previously type in, by default on every Ubuntu machine. This will be powered by small models, the likes of things like Whisper. Turns out that actually speaking to a model and getting text output is really easy. Plumbing it into all of the various places where you can type text on a modern desktop is going to be the tricky part, but I have faith in the desktop team to pull that off. And I think that's just the first step in accessibility. Now, I see this for most people, this is a convenience means. Why type like an animal to your agent when you can just talk to it? But if you are impaired in some way, perhaps you are visually impaired, I think the introduction of AI models is going to be a game changer. There are certain technologies which are absolutely critical for classes of users, like screen readers, which bluntly suck, right? Which I think can just get so much better with, if you're essentially taking a frame buffer or the output of a camera and feeding it into an LLM, I think it's just going to do a much better job of articulating what's on that screen and what actions might be available to a user. So I see this as simultaneously a great usability enhancement for everybody, but also could be the start of a really important journey for accessibility in Ubuntu. I'm going to be an impossible tease now and leave this very nebulous statement up on here, which is to say there will be some new ways of interacting with your machine coming to Ubuntu. Mark has talked about sandboxing, has talked about all the amazing things agents can do. And one of my feelings is that Linux has become this incredible sort of mosaic of open source, which is like, if you peel back the covers a bit of a modern Linux desktop, every so often I get this feeling of amazement that it kind of works at all, and let alone how well it works these days. And I think what's interesting about Linux is it has so many different knobs and buttons and things you can tweak to make it do exactly what you want if you know how. But now the thing is, almost everybody can get a thing that knows how. And so I see this as a really interesting way to get more people into Linux and using the desktop productively, because no longer is productive usage of Linux desktop in really esoteric environments predicated on 20 years of being a Linux desktop hacker, which I know many of you are proud to be. And so I would like to think of new ways for everybody to interact with their machine, taking advantage of the fact that we now have things like LLMs. And interestingly, as we've looked into how to do this, it turns out that many of the technologies we've been pushing for years, like Snaps, are just a wonderful fit. If you think of a sort of agent type experience on your machine that has a number of tools that it can call to do things for you on your behalf on your machine, if each of those tools has its own confinement profile, that suddenly starts to become quite interesting. And we don't have to do any work to get that. We already have it in Ubuntu natively ready to go. So my hope is to be much more transparent about exactly what this is by giving you something to play with in the next 6 months. It won't be finished, but it will be awesome. And I think it's going to be the next most exciting thing in getting people engaged in the desktop experience on Linux. But if we take a moment to just look back at what the team has done in the last 6 months, I am incredibly proud of what the team have pushed out with the Resolute Raccoon, not least because I think the mascot is awesome. This was the first LTS release under the kind of new manifesto that I have been pounding into Ubuntu engineering under the sort of general banner of like the beatings will continue until morale improves. But they have risen to the challenge so wonderfully. It's been a real pleasure to see not only that team growing literally in numbers, but in how they go about their business. And I think it's quite clear to see that from the coverage you see in the media. I have been joking with some of our colleagues that for anybody who doesn't like Ubuntu, it's a bit of a rough time at the moment because you literally can't get away from us on the internet. And I think that is in part due to a much increased cadence of communication, whether that's blogs, whether that's on Mastodon, whether that's people appearing on podcasts, community interactions. And I think this is really, really important. For years, Canonical has been doing a bunch of things seemingly in secret. And what's really interesting is I go and talk to prospective customers, I talk to community members, and watch their eyes light up when I describe some of the things that can be done in our ecosystem. And I think we're doing a much better job of conveying that now. Automation was another key piece. The release team, bless them, all sort of collectively went white when I told them that the first thing we were going to do to fix our release process was ship it every month. But they've done it. They literally, I was expecting chaos and to miss the first few, but they literally shipped every single one of them on time on the day without missing a beat. And that is in part due to some heroic efforts in the background, but in part due to an increasing set of automation, an entire new release machinery powered by Go and Temporal and some other exciting technologies, which has completely transformed the way that we build, test, release Ubuntu. And we really started to see the fruits of that with the LTS release. Lots of the existing processes that have kept Ubuntu sacred, things like the stable release updates, the developer membership board, the MIR processes are all important and kind of deliberately gating or difficult processes to go through. My view is they need to be difficult in the sense that they are there to protect the quality of the community and the operating system, but they also need to not get in the way. And so we've spent a lot of time studying where things get stuck, understanding where we can improve the throughput, staffing up those teams more with upskilling. And we've seen more new core developers in Ubuntu in the last 6 months than I think we had in the previous 3 years as a result of doing that. So really, really pleased to see that kicking off too. And finally, modernization. The sort of poster child of which has been shipping Rust utilities, which has had the delightful side effect of earning me a whole new set of nicknames on the internet. So in 2604 LTS, we did core utils. So this is move, CP, RM, LS, all of the stuff that people kind of know as the de facto Unix-like experience on Linux. And many thanks to Sylvester and the team at UUtils for that. They pulled off a heroic effort, a combination of their work and 2 funded security audits by Canonical to kind of clean up any remaining bugs. But critically, in sudo rs, which sits right at the privilege boundary on every single Ubuntu machine on the planet. That is now a much tighter memory-safe tool that doesn't implement some of the features that we have collectively learned. Perhaps we're a little ill-informed. And I'm really, really pleased to see that happen. And we're not done. So coming up is UPKI. UPKI is essentially an acknowledgement of the fact that lots of the excellent cryptographic practices that we have in browsers these days were actually just absent on Linux systems. Like, raise your hand if you knew that when you curl something at your command line, it completely ignores certificate revocation lists. Or if the server is misconfigured and doesn't send you the full certificate chain, while it might work great in your browser, it will fail at the command line. And this has always been the case. This has never been a thing on Linux. And we are funding some work through the Russells team. So Russells is the TLS implementation for Rust, essentially like an all Rust equivalent of OpenSSL, to build a utility called UPKI. The U is actually for universal, not Ubuntu, but it is kind of fitting. And this will provide certificate revocation. It will also provide support for things like intermediate preloading, and also give us a platform to implement modern PQC algorithms, potentially things like Merkle tree cryptography, right at the system level in Ubuntu. And alongside the utility itself, we are also doing the work in OpenSSL, GNU TLS, curl, and those utilities to make sure that that is plumbed all the way through. And my hope is that, while I think Ubuntu will get it first, this I really hope will proliferate out, throughout the Linux ecosystem, and potentially out even to things like the BSDs and such. It's built deliberately to be something that can be used as widely as possible. It's sort of a contribution back, if you will. NTP-DRS, I'm very excited about, because when we land that, it will be the only single binary, single configuration utility that gets you NTP, NTS, and PTP, no messing around, done. Which has been an incredibly painful thing in the past for anyone who has enjoyed setting up precision time on Linux. This is going to be a huge uplift. And hopefully it's clear we're picking the kind of path through memory safety rewrites quite carefully to hit the most critical things first. And I think cryptography, time synchronization, and privilege escalation are right at the forefront of that. And then compression libraries are interesting for a different reason. So this cycle, we're going to swap out bzip2 for a Rust implementation, and we will also try and target zlib and zstandard by 2804. And this is interesting for a different reason, and that is efficiency. The bzip2 implementation is up to 50% more efficient in Rust. And if you think how many servers are lighting up CPUs right now with bzip2 in the world, that is a monumental difference in energy consumption if we can roll it out across every machine. So the more of these compression algorithms we can get across, the more efficiency there is, the less power is being consumed, and the more, I guess, cycles your agents can eat. But you know what I mean. This is huge. I'm still being surprised by people's eyes lighting up about this. It happened just yesterday at a customer meeting. You can now just apt install CUDA and apt install ROCm, and I have personal experience to suggest that it just works. My AMD GPU has never sung as nicely as it does on 2604, and I didn't have to endure any pain. It was wonderful. So huge thanks both to AMD and NVIDIA, and also the partner teams that sit kind of alongside Ubuntu engineering that have made this happen. I think this is a huge uplift in usability and in performance for the platform. I think by now, this is almost boring because we've got quite good at it. We ship the very latest Linux kernel, we ship the very latest GNOME, no excuses. Even if they're in release candidate, you're going to get the latest, and the team haven't blinked on that. It was looking like we might ship an RC kernel this time, but thankfully it all lined up. And I very much intend to continue this. I think it becomes even more prevalent where we've got such a pace of evolution in hardware. This was a really long coming feature, first-class support for TPM-backed FDE. This is now generally available on the desktop and will be rolling out to server over the next couple of cycles. This is essentially an analogous experience to what you would get with BitLocker or FileVault. It has some really nice side effects for the user, which is you get better security and better usability, which is a rare treat. But also for enterprises, we've built in first-class support for things like recovery key escrow to landscape. So if you're a system administrator managing a bunch of workstations and you don't want that awkward conversation when someone needs their disk recovering, it should be covered. So this will continue to improve and roll out to our server and cloud instances as we go forward. And then a few other little goodies. We now have a dual-tracked container invert stack, so you can stick on a nice stable version if you want, or you can have the rolling versions. Traditionally, the LTS had the rolling version because container runtimes were still quite exciting 10 years ago, and they kept changing every 5 minutes. Now they're a bit more stable, and some people would prefer that kind of pick a version and stick there for 2-year approach. We continue to ship the latest and greatest tool chains. There was a begrudgingly very excited article about our dev pack for Spring, which is a really fast way to get started with Java development, and they were absolutely livid that we've made it so excellent with snaps. I'm delighted. But we continue this good work. Our Rust team has grown enormously. We have a Zig preview, so you can now apt install Ghosty, and it's built from source properly with a Zig toolchain in the archive, which is very nice. We continue to work on cloud authentication with Auth-D. This is if you are an Entra ID or a Google Cloud or an Okta or a Ping or a Duo house, you can have your users authenticate to their Ubuntu machine in a first-class way with an OIDC identity provider. And we introduced architecture variant support, which allows us to basically ship entire copies of the archive that have been specifically optimized for different versions of an instruction set. And we started with AMD 64 v3, but we will be rolling this out for various different versions of ARM and the RISC-V ecosystem as we go forward. And this is essentially not just for DEBs, this is for snaps and rocks and charms and all of the other things that we do. When you do put your hands in your the ever needing deeper pockets to buy hardware, this is to ensure you get the very best of it, right? You're not buying a machine that has a hardware acceleration for a particular instruction that never gets used. You are using all of the capability of the machine. And two final points. We are now running previews for Ubuntu Core in the public cloud. I think this is going to be killer. Why would you not want to run your kubelet on a confined, essentially immutable operating system, or your very specific cloud workload in a super confined, immutable operating system? This is available on Azure, it's available on AWS, it's available on Google Cloud. And we did lots more work on permissions prompting in snaps. This was an incredibly kind of intricate piece of work that went all the way from the kernel through AppArmor into snapd, up into GDM, and even like a user space application. That means when your snapped application does hit confinement and it needs the camera and it hasn't been told it can have it, it can surface a prompt and say, "I'd like to use your camera. Would you like to give access?" So much as you will have become accustomed to on iOS and Android, we're bringing that to the desktop too. How we surface that on server is still a little bit unclear. It turns out notifications at TTY is kind of complicated, but I have a bit of a plan. We'll be rolling that out over the coming cycles. And that's all from me. Have a stonking summit.